Hello all, welcome to Tip Top C Sharp Tutorials. This is a first video of common C Sharp interview questions. Today we'll be covering execution sequence for a class when a class is loaded or a new instance of class is created in C Sharp.net. The tricky part in this question is we would not have used all the components that form this answer or would not have even time to details how execution exactly happens for a class. This is a day-to-day work that we do, but we may not have given much time for this one. So moving on to, let's have a look at agenda. Agenda for today will be execution sequence, how execution happens, and in parallel I will be switching to Visual Studio in and out, and then tips and tricks. Let's start the topic. Class execution sequence. We'll start with the basic one and then make the case complicated step by step. Class execution sequence with constructor. So let's flip to Visual Studio. For ease of understanding, I have already created project. I have created a class called as my class and it has simple constructor. If I execute this one, yeah, as we already know, the first thing that gets executed is my class constructor. So that should be simple enough. Now, this is the first step. The second step is when we have member variables. Let's see what happens when we have member variables. Let's add some member variable. It can be private int my count equals to 10, and I would like to place a breakpoint on the count itself so that I'll get to know which one gets executed first. So if I'll run the project now. Now you can see that my count or the variable that I have defined, member variable, is getting executed first, as you can see in the highlight, and then you see that the constructor is getting executed. Yeah, so coming back to our PPT. So once if I call constructor of my class, member variables are executed first, then the constructor. So this is the second step. Third step is what happens if we have a static members. So let's add a static member and see. So I'll be adding a static string my name. I want to assign a name that is series. I'll have a breakpoint over here as well. Now if I execute, you can observe that my name or a static variables are getting allocated first and then member variables and then the constructor. So I'll stop the debugging now. Now if we go back after my class, the next thing that gets executed is static members. Once it is done with static members, it will be member variables of the class, then the constructor. That is, we want to have a static constructor. What happens if we have a static constructor? This is a tricky part. We would not have used static constructor much in our day-to-day work. Static constructors are used to assign value to static variables, and I'll switch to Visual Studio to demonstrate it. Let's define a static constructor. I'll have a static constructor that is my class, and I want to execute my name equals to part 1. Now I'm planning to change this static variable. Now if you see it, static variable cannot be made as public. Now if I define as public, then it will start showing as an error. So static constructor will be always private. It will be called by default by compiler. Let's see execution sequence. I'll place a breakpoint over here and I will run the debugger. Now if I see, as we already know, the first thing that gets executed is static member. Then if you see it, it is static constructor. So once done with static member, it will go to static constructor. Then it will change the value. In static constructor, you can access only static members. You cannot access non-static members. And then normal member variable and then the constructor. So the sequence comes down like this. Once when I call a when I want to create a new class, object, static members, then static constructor, member variables, and constructor at the end. We have to understand here one thing, that is static constructor and static member variables are called only once for the class, either one when the class is accessed first, or it may be when first object is created. So if you are creating second object for the class, then sequence will turn out to be like this, where once you call the constructor, then static constructor or static member variables will not be allocated memory or will not execute again. Directly it will go to member variables and then the constructor. I will not be demonstrating this one. Moving on. How will be the class execution when you are deriving from some other class? Which one will be executed first, which one will be executed later? Let's see this one with Visual Studio first, then I will demonstrate the sequence over here. Now I will copy paste the same one over there so that it can have my base class and my class will derive from my base class. Now I'll place breakpoint at every place. Now I will execute. Let's see how the sequence of events will turn out. Now if you see, my class is deriving from my base class. Base class also has static members, also has member variables, and also has a static constructor and normal constructor. But first child static members are executed, then child static constructor will get executed, then child member variables will be executed, then it will go back to base static member variables, then base constructor, then base member variables and base constructor, then it will come back to the class construction where it will complete the execution. Now let's switch back to PPT. Now if we see, when I create a class which is deriving from some other class, child static members will be executed first, then child static constructor, then child member variables. Once it is done with child member variables, base static members variable will be created, base static constructor will be called, base member variables will be created, and then base constructor, and then callback goes to child constructor, which completes the construction of the object. So now this is the trickiest one, where the child class also has static members and static constructor, and base class also has static constructor and static members. And another part that we need to understand is static members or static constructor is executed only once for the class. If you are creating number of objects, this will not be executed multiple times. Moving on. There are tips and tricks that you need to remember whenever such interview question is asked to use. Static constructor will be a private constructor and cannot be called from outside. It will be called internally from compiler or CLR automatically. Static constructor can be used to assign values to static variables. If you don't want to assign a variable and leave it, or if you want to load a file, you can do it at the time of static constructor. Static constructor and static member variables are called only once for the lifetime of class, but whereas member variables and default constructor or customized constructor will be called each time a object is created. So this is what is another important point about static constructor and static member variables. This will cover most part of how a class is executed whenever we want to create a new object out of a class. That should cover most part of it. Thanks for listening. Let us know if we have missed out any of the part.